This episode is brought to you by Temptations Cat Treats. Your cat will come running for the perfectly irresistible Temptations Creamy Puree and Temptations Lickable Spoon Cat Treats. The best time to feed lickable cat treats to your cat is anytime. Feed by hand for a playful moment, in a bowl for a creamy treat, or as a topper to make mealtime fun. Visit temptationstreats.com to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. The wreckage from President Trump's sweeping new tariffs is only beginning, and some of the leading victims could be Trump's own supporters. China has slapped enormous retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports, and the last time this happened, during Trump's first term, U.S. farmers got absolutely slaughtered. Now there are indications that Trump's escalating trade wars could be a whole lot worse for farmers this time around. So is there a point at which Trump's own supporters could turn on him over the damage he's unleashing? What other Trump-backing constituencies could get clobbered here? We've got a great guest to explain all this today, Tom Schaller, who co-wrote the book White Rural Rage with Paul Waldman. Really good to have you on, Tom.
Great to be here, Greg. Thanks for inviting me.
So according to multiple reports, farmers around the country fear that Trump's trade wars could be much worse for them than last time. China just said they're going forward with retaliatory tariffs of 34% on U.S. imports. China's aiming directly for politically sensitive sectors for Trump, like agriculture and industry. A lot of that's in Trump country. Tom, what do you make of this? How important are Chinese markets to rural America right now?
Well, Chinese markets are important to all Americans, but the impact, Greg, as you suggest, may be disproportionate for rural communities. Rural communities, of course, are much more dependent on so-called extractive economies, right? Mining, farming particularly. And there's a little bit more heavy industry because, you can't have major plants and stuff in rural and suburban areas for zoning and just property cost reasons and so forth. So, when Paul and I wrote the book, we got tons of angry emails from people. And the general form of that is, I hope you don't need to eat or drive your car ever again because energy is produced in rural America and all your food and meals are produced here. Now, that's a bit of a stretch. And of course, in any economy, so what? I mean, you can make potatoes and sell them to me, and people in the cities can make electronics and sell them to you. Nobody, and no liberal or no Democrat, ever says to rural America, hey, you don't make MRIs or put people through MRIs. You got to come into the big city and see the doctor. I hope you don't get sick, because that's how an economy works. We don't expect every community to make every product. But because extractive industries are disproportionately located in rural communities, and because rural Americans disproportionately rely on those commodities, when the kinds of things that a still developing country like China needs, like food, the same people who have been yelling at my co-author, Paul Waldman, who you know well, and I, about, hey, I hope you don't need to rely on food, are going to be the same people who are going to bear, not all, but a disproportionate brunt of tariffs if they stay in place, like the ones that we are hearing Trump is going to impose on China, and the reciprocal response, which, of course, China has already announced.
Well, according to the American Farm Bureau Federation, underscoring your point, more than 20% of farm income comes from exports. The last time this happened, farmers really got hurt badly by Chinese retaliatory tariffs, which were aimed at U.S. exports like soybeans, corn, and wheat. And as far as I can tell, the farm economy is actually weaker now, in part because of that. Can you recount what happened last time Trump did this and China retaliated?
Yeah, so Trump put tariffs on a variety of products, and China retaliated, and so that had an adverse effect on American farmers. What happened was Trump, who of course declared that trade wars are easy to win, I guess they are easy to win if you don't mention the fact that you end up having to pass a bill with something like $30 billion in bailouts to farmers to compensate, essentially subsidize their losses endured from, decreased demand for their products because of the reciprocal tariffs that other countries put on you. I mean, I think Trump, as you know, is a guy who views the world transactionally, and he projects his view onto everybody else. And so what he believes is that every negotiation, every deal, by definition, it has to be zero sum. It can't be non-zero sum. It can't be collectively good for both sides. So that means there's got to be a winner and there's got to be a loser. And Donald Trump never loses, right? So he's always got to be the winner. And so he assumes that the person on the other side is just always going to buckle, is always going to give in, and that they're not going to respond in kind. And he's already learned, I mean, I don't know if he did learn, but he should have already learned from the first term experiment here that other countries aren't going to take this lying down. And China's a major economy, and that they're going to reciprocate in kind, and it's going to extract costs from your domestic producers. And then you're going to have two choices. They're either going to go bankrupt, which is probably what the Farm Bureau is implying, Greg, that it weakens the industry because some of the producers end up not recovering and having to go out of business. Or you have to bail them out, which means you're taking money out of the treasury, which you could have just given to them as a direct subsidy without having the tariffs in the first place. So you're just spending money to pay down the cost of the tariffs that you imposed.
Well, speaking of Trump's zero-sum worldview in which there are only winners and losers, he's already raging about what China did with its retaliatory tariffs. On Truth Social, in all caps, on Friday, he said, "China played it wrong. They panicked. The one thing they cannot afford to do." Now, I don't really claim to be a China expert, but panic isn't the kind of thing that I think they do. Right? They seem to be pretty deliberate in thinking this type of stuff through. And as you point out, this happened once before, and their retaliation actually did successfully, from their point of view, target Trump country. Here, though, Trump is trying to make it look as if China's already losing because everything at all times always has to revolve around his infallibility and dominance.
Everybody knows that a bully is really just a coward with a rich daddy and a big microphone and a fancy car. And of course, Trump is both of those things: a bully who had a rich daddy and he has a big mouth. But inside, it's just a coward, and the coward usually picks on the weak, right? They usually slam the kids up against the locker who are too weak to do anything and don't have enough friends, because they may back down. When you put tariffs on a tiny little country that maybe relies on only a couple of industries, you could devastate an entire country because they don't have, the power economically to respond. China is not one of those common countries, Greg, right? Like, China is a major growing force. And when they respond, you feel that, right? You're not beating up the wimpiest little kid who's 3 years behind you and is a college freshman. You're picking on another, senior who's across the line from you on the varsity football team.
Underscoring the point is the fact that, as you point out, the government last time spent tens of billions of dollars to bail out farmers. Now, the Trump administration is reportedly mulling another aid package for farmers. Now, this is a tacit admission that they know their policies will absolutely devastate farm country. And this time we're going to have many more retaliatory tariffs from many other countries because our tariffs are much broader as well. Is it really going to be possible to bail out farmers this time, given how much worse it could be?
Well, first of all, it could be difficult because it's expensive. But to your point, if they got to do selective bailouts for all these industries that are severely hampered, and even if they start with just the industries that are in the most favorable parts, the most reddish parts of America, it's still going to be costly for them to do it, right? And I think there's a real opportunity, a political opportunity here for the Democrats to say, you've got Elon Musk going around with his little Doge marauders trying to say you got 10 billion here and 5 billion here, and sometimes only a few million here and there. And every time you got to create a bailout because of retaliatory tariffs, you're just eating away at all that, supposed savings from waste, fraud, and abuse, because you're having to pour it right back out of the treasury to bail out industries that are otherwise going to collapse under the pressure of the retaliatory tariffs, whether they come from China or whether they come from Europe or whether they come from South America. And so there's an opportunity to point out, like, whatever money we've been saving is going to be poured right back in. Now, Pete Navarro, as you know, has said projected that the new tariffs, if they stay in place, are going to generate, I think, $600 to $700 billion in revenues annually. Now, I did some quick math before I came on. Last year, our federal revenues were $4.9 trillion. Let's call it $5 trillion. And the share of that that's generated by tariffs is 1.7%. Let's round that to 2 to make the math easy. 2% of $5 trillion is $100 billion. So they're claiming, though most economists say they're way exaggerating, they're claiming $600 to $700 billion in new tariffs. And I suppose Trump could say, well, the new tariff money that I'm going to generate is going to offset any bailouts. But of course, that money actually comes from us anyway, Greg, right? That's just tariffs as a taxation. So you're really just moving money around to pay people, and they're going to pay more, in retail prices for a variety of things because of the tariffs we're imposing. But then you're going to have to use that money to bail out the higher cost or the lost sales from the retaliatory placed on us. So we're just moving money around, and it's really extraordinarily stupid and inefficient.
Spring is finally here. For us in DC, that means cherry blossom, warmer weather, and more breaking news each and every day. To stay up to date on all the news that you need to know, there's no better place than the DSR Network. And there's no better way to enjoy the DSR Network than to become a member. Members enjoy an ad-free listening experience, access to our Discord community, exclusive content, and more. Use code DSR2025 for a 40% off discount on sign-up at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's code DSR2025 at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
Well, exactly. Tariffs are a tax on consumption in the United States, and the people who pay that are working class and middle class consumers. So when Trump says we're going to have $600, $700 billion in revenues, also watch me extend my tax cuts for the very rich, he's explicitly saying that he's taking money from the poor and giving to the rich. He's explicitly saying that he's shifting the tax burden from the wealthy to the poor and middle class. And yes, I agree. Democrats have a huge opening. I think they should say it that way. They should go out into rural America and say, Trump is screwing you to give himself and all his rich pals a big tax cut.
Yeah, and it's not just rural Americans, working class Americans who live in cities and suburbs who are, have jobs around sort of the median household income, $55,000, $65,000 a year. Because any sales tax is regressive, because a rich man and a poor man pay the same essentially flat tax. That's why Herman Cain, remember the old 999? Any sales tax is inherently regressive, right?
You guys wrote a good book about how rural America is hurting itself serially, decade after decade, by not holding Republican leaders accountable for what their policies have done to the residents of those places. Now, Trump might have the most support in rural America of any politician in many decades, right? Yet, at the same time, he's hurt them enormously, from COVID denial and failure causing tens or even hundreds of thousands of needless deaths in Trump country to these tariffs. How do you account for this disconnect? What are you and I missing here?
Well, Paul and I wrestled with this at the end of the book. And, it's convenient to just sort of lean on Tom Frank's argument from What's the Matter with Kansas, a very important book that was written about 20 years ago and inspired a previous book I wrote, Whistling Past Dixie, because there's this notion that people are voting against their economic interests. And there's certainly some truth to that. But I don't think necessarily rural voters or conservative voters are always voting against their economic interests. Or if they are, they feel that that's offset by the fact that they're voting for their social and cultural interests. That, for example, they believe abortion is murder, and so they don't care if it costs them out of their pocket to save, the lives of unborn babies. So when we say like they're voting against their interests, I think we have to be very clear, because I don't think when they vote for somebody like Trump or George W. Bush, for that matter, or Mitt Romney, they're voting against many of their social and cultural interests, and they may simply apply greater salience or weight to that than they do, their ability to, cover their healthcare costs, or their ability to limit their co-pays and out-of-pocket expenses, or their tax rates, or their local industries. But on the economic side of the equation, I do think they are voting in many cases against their economic interest, and this is a serious problem. And, I think Democrats and liberals are on the horns of a dilemma between saying, ha, 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 FAFO, you fucked around and now you found out, and you vote for what you got, and you got what you voted for. And as Mencken said, you're going to get your democracy good and hard here, which is not a very empathetic or liberal attitude in the broadest sense. But of course, these people are voting against the economic interests of the rest of America and denigrating suburbanites and urbanites and criticizing them. And they would certainly take their victory laps of owning the libs. So I don't think we should have retaliatory, sort of vindictive, vengeful attitudes. But I do think Democrats should point out these inconsistencies in an effort to try to claw back. Sadly, however, I think because of racial resentments and because of their cultural attachments, it might move the dial a little bit with white rural voters, but it's really probably not going to move it that much. I hate to be grim and dismal about it, but there's no real evidence to suggest that they're going to be moved off. They're like dogs on a bone with a lot of these cultural and social issues, and their belief that cities get all the money and everybody's looking down on them, and that, you know, they pay taxes and it all goes to minorities for Obama phones. You just can't convince them otherwise on this stuff. So they continue to vote for the people who sell them those red meat cultural politics.
Well, that brings me to the final question, which is the age-old one. Does an epic screwing over of farm country, of rural America, of Trump country by Donald Trump through these tariffs, does it open the door to Democrats starting to get back some of these voters? You sounded pretty skeptical there, but you don't really have to move the needle much. And all indications now are that Democrats are going already deep into red country, really trying to, talk to these voters about what's happening with Donald Trump and Doge and Elon Musk. They're holding town halls in some of these places. I think there's the capacity to move the needle a little bit. What are the prospects for that?
Well, maybe that they move the needle a little bit because Trump has reached maximum Republican support in rural areas, whether it's rural whites or rural non-whites. But to peg your question to a part of the previous question that I didn't answer on COVID, the reason I'm a little bit grim about it is because after the vaccine was available in 2021, the first wave, the Delta wave that summer, the first wave after vaccines, it was very clear who got sick and hospitalized and died. And it was in the counties that were the Trumpiest counties, because those counties had the lowest vaccination rates, because they believed all of this scurrilous conspiracies about how the vaccines don't work or the vaccines actually give you COVID. They didn't want to wear masks. And so even though rural America has a built-in social distancing advantage, people literally live far away from each other. They don't get on trains and buses and commute. They don't live in stacked apartment buildings like I do here in Washington, D.C. They should have had the lowest rates. They did have lower rates before the vaccine, but they should have had even lower rates after the vaccine as long as they took the vaccine. But no, what happened? The rural counties had 2.4 times the death rates of the national average. And compared to city counties, it was 3 and 4 to 1, depending on which counties of reference point. They died at 3 to 4 times the rate. Literally tens of thousands of rural Americans, excessive rural Americans, died because of Trump and because their belief that COVID was a hoax and all this other stuff, and Dr. Fauci and the Fauci-ouchie, and listen to people like, even though Trump took the vaccine, he told them, right, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and so forth. So MAGA conspiracy, fueled theories about the virus and about the safety of it literally led to excessive deaths in rural America, because if you look at the charts of Trump support and rurality, they go up like this. The more rural the area, the more they support Trump. And then if you look at those same charts and they track rurality with vaccine, it's just the opposite. So the Trumpier the county, the less likely people took the vaccine, and therefore the highest hospitalizations and death rates. Rural Americans are making decisions and have voted for Trump to bring this back to tariffs. They're making decisions that don't just affect their communities. They affect other communities and other industries that are parallel or adjacent. And so now it's economic metaphor here, but it's an economic murder-suicide when you make these kind of decisions that don't just hurt your bottom line, your finances, your ability to pay for Johnny's braces or Joni's summer camp. Now you're affecting industries and communities and devastating your neighbors including your neighbors who didn't vote for Trump, especially your non-white rural neighbors.
So, Tom, how should Democrats talk to rural Americans about this? How do they go into red America, some of these swingy House districts, some of these red states, some of these red House districts, which I think are going to be in play in 2026? How do Democrats go in there and say what you're saying in a way that makes it possible to win over 2, 3, 4 points among those demographics? How do they talk about the tariffs? How do they talk about Trump? What do they say?
I mean, I think they try to talk in the same language that Trump talked about during the election, right? And maybe like Trump, they exaggerate a little bit about the prices of things. I mean, Trump has lied consistently. He said the unemployment rate under Obama was 42% in one tweet. And he says Biden created the worst economy in American history, even though The Economist magazine, no liberal rag that, said our economy was the envy of the world by the end of the Biden administration. It wasn't perfect, but we did manage inflation better than any other Western European democracy. We created 700,000 industrial jobs. So go in there and frankly, scare them with stories about the economic consequences. The problem, Greg, is where they get their information. I spent time in rural Pennsylvania the weekend before the election, and in places like Cumberland and Lancaster, we didn't see Republicans out in the streets because they don't really do field campaigns anymore. It's all digital and electronic and through people's phones, not through people's front doors. And so it's really hard to get face to face with people anymore. And so from a media strategy or a tactic, I suppose you'd said, whatever that message is, Democrats got to get on these local radio shows. They got to create their own local radio shows. They got to get on these podcasts because they're living in an informational vacuum or a silo. And so they're not hearing these messages anyway. We've seen already, as you've seen on Blue Sky today, Fox News, OANN, they're not even putting the market reports up there. They're not even showing the Dow and the S&P and the NASDAQ on their tickers because they know that their listeners and viewers cannot handle any negative news. They need to be constantly reinforced with nonstop pro-red, pro-Republican, pro-Trump, pro-MAGA news because they can't handle the truth, as Jack Nicholson would say. We need to break through that and force them to listen to alternative messages. But that is a really, really difficult sort of nut to crack.
It sure is, and it just seems to get more difficult with every passing year and every passing cycle. Tom Scheller, it's so good to talk to you, man. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be here. Cheers, Greg.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.